Today on Bench Briefs, we're looking at a fascinating case that sits at the crossroads of environmental regulation, Indigenous rights, and commercial interests. Mowi Canada West Inc., vs. Canada, Fisheries, Oceans, and Coast Guard, is a decision from the Federal Court of Appeal that challenges how the government balances these sometimes competing priorities. Let's start by breaking down what happened. Mowi Canada West Inc. is a major player in the commercial fish farming industry, operating fish farms along the Canadian coast. These operations are important for food production and local economies, but they don't exist in isolation. Some of the areas where Mowi farms fish overlap with territories where Indigenous groups hold fishing rights protected under Canadian law. These rights aren't just about fishing for food or livelihood. They're deeply connected to Indigenous culture and identity. The Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard stepped in after consultations with Indigenous groups raised concerns. These groups argued that Mowi's fish farming activities were interfering with their Aboriginal fishing rights. In response, the minister imposed restrictions on Mowi's operations in those overlapping areas. The goal was to respect Indigenous rights while managing the environmental and commercial aspects of fish farming. Mowi challenged this decision, arguing two main points. First, they said the consultation process with Indigenous groups wasn't adequate. Consultation is a legal duty in Canada whenever government decisions might affect Indigenous rights, and Mowi claimed this duty wasn't properly fulfilled. Second, Mowi argued that the minister's decision was unreasonable and failed to consider all relevant factors, including the economic impact on their business and scientific evidence about fish farming's effects. So, what were the legal issues the court had to decide? The key questions were, did the minister meet the duty to consult Indigenous groups in a meaningful way before imposing restrictions? And was the minister's decision itself reasonable and lawful, considering the consultation process and the evidence about how fish farming impacts Aboriginal fishing rights? The duty to consult is a cornerstone of Canadian law when it comes to Indigenous rights. It requires the government to engage with Indigenous peoples in good faith, provide information, and consider their concerns before making decisions that could affect their rights. The depth of consultation can vary depending on the potential impact, but it must be more than just a formality. In this case, the court examined whether the consultations were thorough and whether the minister adequately balanced the competing interests. Importantly, the court looked at whether the minister's decision was supported by evidence and whether all relevant factors were weighed fairly. Why does this case matter? It highlights the ongoing challenge of reconciling Indigenous rights with economic development and environmental stewardship. Fish farming is a growing industry that promises jobs and food security, but it also raises legitimate concerns about environmental impacts and the protection of Indigenous ways of life. This case underscores the importance of meaningful consultation, a process that respects Indigenous voices and rights while allowing for responsible resource management. The Federal Court of Appeal's decision sends a clear message. Governments must take their duty to consult seriously, and decisions affecting Indigenous rights must be reasonable and based on sound evidence. For businesses like Mowi, it means that operating in areas overlapping with Indigenous territories requires navigating not just regulatory hurdles, but also building respectful relationships with Indigenous communities. As Canada continues to evolve its approach to Indigenous reconciliation and resource development, cases like Mowi Canada West Inc. vs. Canada will shape the legal landscape. They remind us that sustainable development isn't just about economics or the environment. It's about respecting rights, history, and the future of all peoples. Thanks for listening to Bench Briefs. Join us next time for another dive into the legal cases shaping Canada today.